Hi, my name's Drew and welcome to another short review Roundup video here on Flying Wiener. Spider-Man No Way Home is coming and I decided in preparation for it I'm going to rewatch all of the Spider-Man films that Sony has made. So I'm not talking about animated films that Marvel themselves have made, just the Sony films starting from the early 2000s. What an exciting ride, particularly the early ones I haven't seen in ages, so this was a really exciting project to get started on. I'm going to share my thoughts of each and every film, and at the end I'm going to do something that I normally never do. I'm going to give you a ranking, my personal ranking of all of the Spider-Man films that we've had until now, just before No Way Home comes. And of course, when that comes out, I will also update this ranking to see how that fits in. So we get started with the first Spider-Man film, came out in 2002, starring Toby Maguire. Now, it is actually a lot better than I remembered it to be. It feels like a really good example of what makes a comic book film, so it's like they established this very early on. It's got great humour, characters themselves have a lot of heart, and the villain is also really magnificent. It's got quite a lot of action in it, but it's definitely not defined by it. It was actually quite funny watching it because when you see the fights and compare it to things that we see nowadays, like particularly Shang-Chi for instance, it feels a lot more like a boxing bar brawl, something like that. So you've just got everyone just exchanging punches quite a lot. So that was really funny. Nowadays it's a lot of kicks and martial artsy stuff, but first Spider-Man film, boxing is all we need. Tobey Maguire is actually an excellent Spider-Man, I do have to say that. And with Willem Dafoe, we've got a really magnificent Green Goblin. He does the character so well. And there's this one scene which is quite similar to what we have with Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, where he's sort of doing both characters. So in this case, he's doing Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin. He's talking in front of a mirror, and I really liked him swapping between the two characters. It just shows, I mean, it really pays off to use wonderful actors in such films. Moving on to Spider-Man 2, came out in 2004. Now this film feels like a very natural progression from the story that we had in the first. In particular, we see the difficulties that Spider-Man at Peter Parker has, and the difficulties you have when you lead this superhero life, and how you can arrange it with your personal life and the problems that arise with that. We see Peter Parker really losing control over so many sections of his life, and just how much he is sacrificing just to have the opportunity to save people, which in and of itself is obviously a very stressful thing to do. You know, having life and death in the palm of your hands and being the one who really can make a difference there. So a lot of the plot lines fall on from the first film, which is also great. So we have this through line. And villain-wise, we have Doc Ock, Dr. Octavius in this one, who is an even better villain than the Green Goblin already was, because he is a purely tragic figure, while Norman Osborn wasn't quite the nice guy at all times. Doc Ock is actually a nice guy and he just wanted to improve humanity, and a tragic accident is what turns him into this villain. So I really like that aspect of it, and he's also a really credible threat for Peter Parker, of course, because these arms and the intelligence combined with it really make for a deadly foe. It's actually kind of a shame that he wasn't able to appear in more films, just like with the Green Goblin. I mean, at least Willem Dafoe's version. One thing I do need to talk about here is the CGI, because it's a lot more noticeable than the previous one. Makes sense, of course, with Doc Ock and his big mechanical arms, but it's just that because there's so many of these scenes, you can kind of tell that the work was spread very thin. They had so many shots to get through, and so the CGI is a lot more noticeable, and you can see that it doesn't hold up as well compared to the first Spider-Man, where of course the CGI was of inferior quality, but it wasn't used so much so you didn't really notice. So that was quite interesting to me to really pay attention to that. More CGI shots obviously exposes you to them not all being that great in terms of looks. But overall, one of the most beloved Spider-Man films, and I absolutely get why. It is a really good film in many ways. Now, Spider-Man 3 came out in 2007. This is a really interesting film because over the years I've seen so many people commenting about it, saying that it's absolutely horrible and really terrible, don't watch it, etc, etc. And to me it was very strange because I had seen the film previously, and in my memory the film wasn't that bad. I thought, you know, these people are just being overly negative like you often have on the internet. But then I rewatched it now, and boy, is it one big glorious mess. The biggest mistake I feel they made is they just added in too many new characters, because we're taking over so many characters from the previous films, and it's understandable that you want to keep things fresh in sequels, but they just put in too much. I mean, we've got so many new characters, and there's really not enough time to fully flesh them out and characterize them. You're adding Sandman, Eddie Brock and Gwen Stacy on top of all the ones that we had previously, and there's just not enough room for all of them. So besides all the new characters, we're constantly jumping back and forth between them and Peter Parker, who is trying to figure out what kind of Spider-Man he wants to be, and it all just becomes a big convoluted mess because there's just too many jumps happening all the time. Villain-wise, it's actually quite a shame, because the Sandman is a character I really liked. I thought and felt he was a very compelling character, but he's not present for a large part of the film, again because we've got so many other things to deal with. And it's not just that, his theme really popped out at me. It's got this sort of melancholic tone, it really draws you in, and it just enhances his character, so it's really a shame that we didn't get to see more of him in this. Then you have Eddie Brock and Venom. So I would love to have a universe where this version of Venom and Eddie Brock meet Tom Hardy's Eddie Brock and Venom, because the two are just, they could not be more different. I don't even get why they forced Venom into this, apart from hoping that it would just get some more fanboy clout, I'll call it. Eddie Brock is through and through a completely unlikable character, and it's just like they said, right, we need to make a bad boy Spider-Man or something like that. It just doesn't fit, because he himself just isn't an imposing and menacing figure. He is just laughable through and through, which you don't want to have for your villain. Really, it does not work. I feel they should have cut him completely from the film and just given us more of James Franco's Green Goblin, because there is an interesting relationship there between him and Peter Parker, of course, and Spider-Man. And by cutting Venom from the film, they would have spared us from the really strange emo Spider-Man plotline, which was just horrible through and through. Nobody enjoys that. Besides all that, I feel that Peter Parker's characterization in this film is just kind of off, because you've got so many scenes at the very start, before he's got the Venom suit and it changes his character. Before that even, we've got so many scenes where you can tell that he is just completely ignorant of MJ and the rough time that she's going through. Now, it does not make sense, because this is not the Peter Parker we had seen in the previous two films. You know, it doesn't make sense to me that he would just not notice what she's going through, even with all the glory he is currently living through as Spider-Man, you know. And that is just weird for me. You can't just cause drama in films by straight up changing the characterization of one person without really giving them a background for it, or really a reason to do so. I mean, so much more could be said about this film, but I think it's best to not dwell on it for too long. Otherwise it's just going to make this video far too long, really. What I will say across all Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films is that Kirsten Dunst is really great as MJ, and I really enjoyed her a lot, and it's a big shame that some of her best and more dramatic scenes are all in Spider-Man 3. And one last thing I will say is that Bruce Campbell from the Evil Dead franchise pops up in these films. He has cameos, and they are among the funniest scenes in all of it, so they're worth watching just for those alone. So we move on to the second person to play Spider-Man, which is Andrew Garfield in the Amazing Spider-Man films. The first one came out in 2012, and I must say straight off the bat, I really like Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. I think he, and particularly his Peter Parker, are really well chosen, and this version of Spider-Man, you know, when he's apprehending criminals, he actually cracks jokes just like I expect Spider-Man to be. You know, it was just such a good fit for the whole thing. Through that, I also noticed these films are a lot more humorous. So in retrospect, I noticed that the first three films don't actually have as much humour as you would expect Spider-Man to have. One thing that is a very big difference is that we get to see a lot more of Peter Parker's scientific side compared to Toby Maguire, so he has to use that brain of his a lot more, and his intelligence when he's fighting people and sort of doing detective work, etc. And that is something that I feel was a really good choice, because it is rather different to what Toby Maguire's Spider-Man did. You have to talk about the CGI as well, of course. I mean, as you can imagine, it's vastly superior, so it's obvious that it's better, but you do have to mention it because it is really good, and obviously you need that a lot for Spider-Man. Then the next thing is they toned it down a lot again, so we're focused on just one villain. We've got the Lizard, and I feel it's a great choice. Not only have we not seen him before in Spider-Man films, but he is a really credible threat, both in terms of physical power, and also he is a brilliant scientist. So, and we do see that Peter Parker struggles a lot with him, and you know, you are wondering at times, is he even going to be able to beat him? So a lot of things are just done really well in this film, and I don't really find much that you can fault it for. I think that they went in a brilliant direction with this new franchise. Which brings me to Amazing Spider-Man 2, which came out in 2014. And coming off of the heels of Amazing Spider-Man, it is really disappointing to watch Amazing Spider-Man 2 because the film is really underwhelming when you compare the two of them. And I really don't get how they made this film. It is also seen by many as one of the worst films in the entire franchise, and unfortunately I really need to agree. But you'll see more of that in my ranking later on. The reason for Amazing Spider-Man 2 not being as great are actually quite similar to Spider-Man 3, because we have just too many characters in here and the whole thing quickly becomes a mess because we're jumping back and forth between them all without staying long enough on one character to really make it worthwhile. The villains themselves are a bit disappointing. Now, Jamie Foxx is great as Electro because in terms of power he's like the Lizard, where he's a real credible threat to Spider-Man, but his motivations are really lackluster, and you can boil the whole thing down to basically being a misunderstanding, which is completely silly. And on top of that, before his transformation, you have the person now Jamie Foxx is playing, the name is Max. He is this really cliched geek, I'll call it, with, you know, no self-esteem, etc. And this goofy nerd, I feel, is even on the verge of parody because he really just overdoes it completely. I didn't think that there's really a human out there who is like Max is in this film. You've got Harry Osborn in this film, and he is someone I feel they could have just left out of the whole thing. It seems like he was shoehorned into this because these Amazing Spider-Man films are tied so closely to Oscorp, so they felt they need to put him in. But after having him in all three previous films with Toby Maguire, I feel it wasn't really necessary to put him in this one as well. Also because his motivations and everything, it's all just a bit too thin for me. You know, all the reasoning behind every action that the villains have. These films didn't need the Osborns. They could have just had Oscorp in the back as being sort of the thing that creates all these villains by accident or whatever means. But you didn't need to put in the Green Goblin and Harry and Norman Osborn. It wasn't necessary. The next thing they didn't need in terms of plot is this whole exploration of Peter's parents. There's a subplot in this film that sort of carries on from previous one. It did nothing for me. I thought they could have just left it out. It just made everything unnecessary. We don't need to know about his parents. I just didn't care about that plotline really. The film does have a few very emotional punches, and that is what really made me think that Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man overall is just a lot better. At least I like him a lot more than Toby Maguire's, because on all levels I feel it is just a great characterization of Peter Parker. The city itself is done wonderfully, so New York looks very, very different to the Sam Raimi films. And just generally it looks massive. And it looks like it's a big jungle that there's always something new to explore, and you don't really want to leave the city. So that is something I really noticed, just how they made the city look was great. The music is something I want to talk about because it's straight up weird for me. If you've been following the channel for longer, you will know that I'm a Hans Zimmer fan, and he did this soundtrack in collaboration with other people, but it does not work for me. You've got a lot of strange pop song choices, and then the music at times, and particularly the big climactic battle against Electro, was just completely weird because it's got this Electro vibe going on, and it just wasn't tense at all. It felt more like music that we would use when Spider-Man is fighting a group of random thugs, you know, to up the coolness factor. Generally, the soundtrack just, to me, seemed like it desperately wanted to be cool. So yeah, it wasn't my taste. It's a real shame we never got a third film in the series, because I feel if they had learned from the second film, the third one could have been amazing if they had done that. Sorry for the pun, but that is really a missed opportunity. Now, that's all I'll say about that, and chronologically speaking, the next Spider-Man appearance would be in Captain America Civil War, but I'm going to leave that out for the same reason that I'm also not going to talk about Infinity War or Endgame, the two Avengers films, because while Spider-Man pops up in them, it's a team thing and there isn't a big focus on Spider-Man. So I think we can just leave that and I'll remain focused on the actual Spider-Man films. So we come to the first Spider-Man film in the MCU, Spider-Man Homecoming. First time we get to see Tom Holland as Spider-Man. It was very interesting. I read about the film that one of the main prerogatives was that they wanted the film to do things very, very new and in a different way. So if the previous films did something in a certain way, they looked into ways to do it differently. And I feel overall they achieved this. There's just some parts of it I'm not a fan of, but I'll go into detail about it in a bit. So we have the obvious MCU influence on the character, particularly on the funny side. This is definitely one of the films with the most jokes in it, which isn't really surprising. But I will say that I felt that with Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, the humour seemed more natural. I don't know, when he's quipping to thugs and stuff like that, it just seemed more of a fit, so that was quite interesting. But overall, yes, more humour. We also have this high school setting, which we did have in previous films, but here it feels really, really fitting, and we do have just obviously this very, very big connection, strong connection to the school, and it just feels most appropriate here. Mainly because Tom Holland is just simply the youngest actor to play him to date. The other two were kind of believable, but not always, I will say. They fit more of a college setting. This Spider-Man, of course, has a very strong influence by Tony Stark. If you've seen the films, you know what I mean. He is really sort of his mentor character, and while I did like it at first, now looking at it from the perspective of a few films and having seen it for a few years now, I'm actually not a big fan of it, because I feel it takes a lot of the agency away from Peter Parker and just his intelligence and just his... Basically, he doesn't really stand on his own 2 feet too much, because we've just got all this big Tony Stark influence on him. And also when it comes to the suit, while the technological suit seems really cool at first with all its gadgets, etc., it's just given to him. And in the other films we've seen Peter Parker, particularly in The Amazing Spider-Man, having to develop all his things himself. So, I just enjoyed that a lot more. Villain-wise, excellent choice. The Vulture is completely new, we hadn't seen him before, and again it's just one villain, which is great. So it does show overall that with these Spider-Man films, if they have less villains, it definitely works in their favour. The choice of Michael Keaton was genius. You've got the obvious Batman reference, and not just that, but you've got films in the genre or adjacent to it like Birdman, so having him play a person with wings again, it's just a very obvious choice. But he himself is great as well. He's got this really gruff voice, and while he's not physically intimidating, I mean, he's not a big muscular guy or anything, it's just, his just pure determination to do whatever he's set his mind to, and those big wings really make an imposing character out of him. And at times, pretty similar to what we've seen with other films, we are not too sure if Peter Parker can actually beat him, which is great. We're also introduced to Ned, who is his best friend in this version, and I really like the dynamic between the two of them. It's a really good fit. It's also something rather new that we haven't really seen so much in previous films. You've got MJ in this as well, and she's not an arsehole, but basically I like arsehole characters, I'll say that straight off the bat. Like John Constantine, Keanu Reeves, when he plays him, is just, he's just awful to most people around him. I really enjoy those kind of characters, and MJ isn't like that, but she's very indifferent, and I just enjoy that. I think it's fun. To me, perfect. So overall, they certainly achieved what they set out to do, and it is a very, very different film to the previous versions, not just because of the MCU tie-in, but just all of the aspects that they combined here, and it is overall a really enjoyable film. Now we have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which is a very, very big departure from all the previous things. It is the only one in this whole series that is actually animated. We're not only introduced to a new Spider-Man, but it's definitely one of the most unique art styles I've ever seen in an animated film. Now, talking about that a bit more, they had the goal to make this film really look like a comic book come to life. While this is said a lot in media about shows and TV films, etc., I feel that for the very first time they actually managed to achieve such a goal, because it really does look like a comic book. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to see it in 3D, because I feel that that was probably the perfect way to watch this film, because so many of the images and objects, etc., even in 2D, really pop out at you. So I assume it must be really great to watch this in 3D. Maybe someday I'll manage to do that. Then you also have this, they sort of played around with the frames a bit. It looks like the movements are a bit motion blurred, and that really gives it that unique feel that I really love. It just really captivates you. So every person moving on screen, it just looks so unique, and it's so cool what they did here. Now, I do have a bit more of an appreciation for this film after having played the two Spider-Man games on PS4 and PS5. The first time I watched this film, I hadn't played those games yet. So now I know a lot more about Miles Morales, and I feel that I can appreciate it a lot more. because I'm the typical guy. I'm usually a bit wary. I'm not against it, I'm just a bit wary when they bring in new versions of an established character, and I was just so positively surprised by Miles Morales, because at times, I know this is going to sound a bit weird, but I feel like he's more Spider-Man than Peter Parker. Because to me, Spider-Man is an excited kid, and Miles Morales is that. It's like while he's doing his things, he at times thinks that this, can't possibly be real, it's a dream and he's going to wake up any second. And I really felt that throughout this film, so he is just really excited to be Spider-Man, which we don't always get from Peter Parker. So yeah, so Miles Morales, a really exciting character, and it also helps that he's got his own new set of powers that go along with the traditional things, so that obviously is very cool too. One thing that this film does, it deals with the multiverse, and we have a lot of other versions of Spider-Man coming in. I've forgotten how many, I think it's 7 or 8 even. So you've got gender swaps, and you've got an animatronic one basically, and then you've got a cartoony one. It's very funny, and it is interesting that while we have all these characters coming in, and I've talked about the other films having too many in it, here for some reason it doesn't become too bloated. I don't know what it is, maybe in animation they realise that you don't need to flesh out every single character, you can just put them in, have them do cool stuff, just don't have them in too much, because otherwise, it feels like we've just got incomplete characters, they just swoop in, do cool things, and then just leave again, and it just works. If this were a live action film, they would really try and force in some characterization, and give us sort of half characters and just make it a mess of it. So despite all this multiversal madness going on, I feel it's a very easy to follow film. The story is very straightforward, simple, and overall can be enjoyed very well. It also has a lot of heart, so it works on so many levels, this film. But at the same time, I will say it feels more like a special episode that you have in a series due to all of this multiverse stuff going on, etc. So I'm more of a fan of really traditional stories. You have, just the superhero, one villain, and we have just this journey over the course of one film. I'm more a fan of those kind of stories, which is why this to me is not the best film in the whole series, but it's really darn good, I will say that. So we come to the last one, Spider-Man Far From Home, the second Tom Holland film which appeared in the MCU, and I'll be honest, this film to me was a bit disappointing. It's not a bad film, it's obviously made very well, and CGI is great, and Tom Holland is still great as Spider-Man. It's just that my expectations of this film and where I thought it would go compared to other Spider-Man films, etc., were just very different. Compared to the first one, I thought that this would be more traditional Spider-Man, where we see him swinging through New York, doing a lot more typical things. We don't even see any of these traditional things because they decided this film is just going to take place throughout Europe. They're on a school trip and they're going through Europe, and I would like to think this is probably because they just got a lot of financial support by filming at various European locations, and that's why they decided to do it. I mean, I guess on paper it sounds fun when you send Spider-Man on a school trip and stuff happens, to interfere with said school trip, but I feel it just didn't really translate well onto the screen. It just makes it a bit more confusing because we don't actually have any meaningful locations in that way. I mean, we're traveling from one place to the next, but ultimately you could have done all this back home, as it were, and you could have gotten the same film probably. Now, I do like that we're not just stuck in the USA all the time. I applaud that, but I just feel that they didn't really make anything out of these settings instead of just having, oh wow, we're in Venice, or in London. But besides this, we still have the shadow of Tony Stark just really hanging over this film. Now, I get it, after Avengers Endgame, yes, he had just died, so we have to address this, which is fine, but it is the through line of the film. Everything revolves around this, and I feel, just let Spider-Man finally be his own person, just really cut these ties to Tony Stark. We have Mysterio here. He appears first time in all of the films, and Jake Gyllenhaal is really great as the character, but while it is great to see someone new, because I didn't know anything about Mysterio, frankly, it's just that overall, in the end, he's a bit underwhelming, I will say. Ultimately, the villain, I feel, is also a bit underwhelming because in the end, he's not really a great big challenge for Spider-Man, and it really comes more or less down to just him, Spider-Man, being just a very gullible person. So if you weren't that gullible, you could pretty much remove the whole plot of the film. So that's a bit very weak, a weak foundation to stand on. And so the villain was only possible because of that. What I will say and I like is that Peter Parker here is a bit more of a veteran Spider-Man. He's not fully there where we want him to be. He does still make rookie mistakes, but I did enjoy seeing him a bit better at what he does, and it does make you wonder when are they finally gonna let him pass his training level, you know, and really be a fully fledged Spider-Man. Overall, I was a bit underwhelmed by this film because it seemed to focus more on the connections and tie-ins to the MCU instead of really just giving us a Spider-Man who is in control of his purpose and skills and everything. So I really hope that No Way Home is going to give us that. Now, I usually don't do rankings on my channel, as you know, but I really wanted to do this after watching all these films in such a short time. I feel that it's very easy to compare them all and to just give you that. So very bottom is Spider-Man 3, unfortunately. Followed by Amazing Spider-Man 2. These two are definitely the most disappointing films. Then we have Spider-Man Far From Home. As you can tell, not a big fan of that either. Then we have the very first Spider-Man film with Toby Maguire. I feel it's a sort of good middle ground nearly, it's somewhere around there. Then we have Spider-Man Homecoming. It's a very solid entry. I feel it just isn't as good as others we have seen. Spider-Man 2 comes next. Many people have this as their top Spider-Man film. I didn't like it quite as much as the others, but it is a very good film, don't get me wrong. Now, the number 2 spot is actually given to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. As I mentioned, this is mainly because to me it feels like more of a special episode, and as a standalone film in that sense, I know it is a standalone film, but I just enjoy the more classical stories. That's just my personal preference, and that is why Amazing Spider-Man, the first Andrew Garfield film, to me is number 1. Very unusual choice, I suppose, on the internet, but it's just overall I feel it has the best package, the best Spider-Man. Great challenge, and while the Lizard isn't an amazing villain, he is a very credible one in this case, and they just handle the whole thing really well. And the aesthetic of it, everything. To me, that's the best film. We'll see what happens after I've seen No Way Home. I will update this list in that video. That will be coming out very soon, hopefully this Saturday. I will see if I'm able to manage it in time. I'll thank you for watching this video. I know it turned out to be a bit longer, but I am talking about 8 films, so you know, the time allocated for each film isn't that long. Let me know what you thought of any of these films down in the comments below, and I hope to see you in the next video on Flying Wiener. Take care, bye.